Businesses have an increasingly powerful role in society. They control a lot of technologies. They also are the source of the majority of carbon emissions. And so we have to figure it out for businesses.
Hello, kia ora.
And welcome to the People Helping Nature podcast.
We're your hosts. I'm Callum.
And I'm Anna, and today we're joined by Carlos from CarbonInvoice. Welcome to the show, Carlos. Thank you for coming on today.
Kia ora, Anna. Kia ora, Callum. Thank you for having me.
It's such a pleasure to have you here. There's a bit of a backstory to you being on this podcast today, which I'd like to share before we get into it. So about 10 weeks ago at the time of recording, a good friend of mine introduced me to Carlos saying, you should really talk to this guy. He's building this really cool business that makes it easy for businesses to plant native forest all around the country and deal with their carbon in a really simple way. I'll let you explain it later. And you might want to have him on your podcast. So we got on a call, we started chatting, and I was just blown away by this solution that we're about to talk about. I had no intention of joining their team. I just wanted to see if maybe we could collaborate and do a podcast episode together. So we agreed to the podcast episode. One thing led to another, and I asked about 100 million questions, and turns out they were hiring a growth person. And lo and behold, now I am part of the CarbonInvoice team. 1 day per week. That was before we agreed to do a podcast. So I just want to put that out there now for sake of transparency. And yeah, let's get into it. So thanks a lot for coming on board today, Carlos. To begin, should we start by giving yourself an introduction and telling us a high level overview of what CarbonInvoice is and what it does?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's been great getting to know each other, Callum, and excited to realize our initial commitment promise of getting on the podcast together. I'm Carlos Chambers. I'm a co-founder of CarbonInvoice. We're a climate software business out of New Zealand, and we are focused on making it easy and rewarding for small businesses to take carbon action. We do that by offering them a way to automatically measure their carbon footprint with 3 minutes of effort using a whole lot of smart data and software. Secondly, to start funding native trees in the communities that they work, live, and play in. And that helps to compensate and mitigate their carbon footprint. And thirdly, providing them with the marketing and sharing collateral to really communicate and tell the story of the great work that they're doing in a way that makes them feel proud, that helps them grow their brand and helps them also inspire other businesses in their network. We've been operating for about 2 years, and we've been growing pretty quickly in New Zealand and Australia and a little bit in the UK. The big idea really is to make it simple, accessible, but also credible and robust way for small businesses to take carbon action. So you've got about the numbers vary a little bit, but between 1 and 10% of small businesses have actually measured their carbon footprint or even have a starting point. The vast majority have not, and we're interested in how we can massively grow that proportion of small businesses who are taking carbon action on this important challenge.
I think the key word there is too hard basket, right? It's for most businesses, you're taking it out of the too hard basket.
And I also think it's because it is such a complex topic, making it simple and 3 minutes, that's nothing compared to what it can take. I mean, we all are on a timer, right? We only have 24 hours in a day. So I think those two key things are super exciting. And as you already mentioned, it's only been going for 2 years. So how did your journey lead to co-founding CarbonInvoice?
About 15 years ago, I resigned from my job as a corporate lawyer at Russell McVeigh, a big corporate law firm, and I wanted to go and work on this challenge of climate change. I worked out that was the biggest problem facing humanity, And I was idealistic and unrealistic about what I could achieve and super hopeful. So I left my law job and basically set out to create a business that, well, it had two criteria: was a business and reduced carbon emissions. I was passionate about entrepreneurship and climate change. And I ended up through a fairly windy journey getting involved with a group of young New Zealanders who were building a youth advocacy group called Generation Zero to help advocate for and do the research for how New Zealand could transition to net zero by 2050. So I spent a few years volunteering for that project. And then following that, I got into software businesses. I thought they were a really interesting way for New Zealand to create proper, clean, green, high leverage, high value exports, which could help us look after our, country and whenua. And then, so that business was called Common Ledger. We were doing stuff with accounting data for small businesses, analysing that and helping them turn it into loan applications and speed up the flow of capital to small businesses. And Common Ledger was going along, and I became really interested in, I kind of turned my focus back to climate and business and thought, what can Common Ledger do? We've got a business, we're not paying attention to our own carbon footprint. And so to your point, Anna, we went and started asking questions, and we engaged a consultant to measure that business's carbon footprint. And that's where I learned about how difficult and costly that process was. So a couple of data points: it took us about 130 hours of our own team's time to do that measurement exercise. It was largely done by our marketing manager at the time, Alex, and she came to me at one point and said, "Carlos, I've found the line. I will not weigh our rubbish." So there was a requirement for me to weigh bags of rubbish each week for an 8-week period. And she said, "I'm not going to do it." She's East German, and she said it in a strong East Germanic way. I found the line. I will not weigh your rubbish. So it took us about 4.5 months to get the measurement done. But when Alex said that to me, that was the penny drop moment, if there was one for me, where I thought, okay, we're a 14-person technology business. There's 400 million other small and medium businesses around the world. I reckon a lot of those are not going to want to weigh the rubbish either. There's an opportunity to make it, dramatically easier. And then we went into R&D mode and started some surveying. We surveyed about 800 businesses around the world in 10 different markets. And we also got into customer or user discovery on actual, the problem space and solutions. The main insights that we heard were, it's in the too hard basket. It feels too difficult. The payoff is not clear to me, and I don't have to do this as a small business. But we also found that the majority of businesses that we surveyed did believe in anthropogenic climate change. I think it was over 50% were interested in taking action, but there was those barriers in the way. So that's what gave us this idea of how do we make it really easy and really rewarding for small businesses to take action. If we could give them a 3-minute measurement and native trees that are growing in the places that they care about, is that enough to start to tip that early, those early adopters and get into the early majority? That was the journey for us. So I'd say if you step back, you'd say there was a long-held intention for me around working on this problem. There was a insight into how hard it was for our business. We had a bit of useful technology already, which we were able to repurpose, which allowed us to make the product development process was like 4 months from when we finished R&D to actually getting product into market. And then that allowed us to learn much faster. So that'd be the founding story of CarbonInvoice.
Yeah, that's fascinating, especially having that personal insight as well. I think that quite often changes the way we think on things, right? If we go, whoa, hang on, I didn't expect it to be that complex. So now that CarbonInvoice is running, what's your mission? What's your main mission with that new journey?
Our mission is seriously simple action for businesses everywhere. So seriously simple means what we offer is credible, robust, and in line with global standards and laws as they evolve. Simple means it's easy for our users. Every interaction with us is simple and easy. We are in the game of reducing global greenhouse gas emissions, and we're doing that not with analysis and complexity. We're trying to help businesses really take that first step and get going, because action breeds momentum, and you feel good when you take action rather than being stuck in a room scratching your head and debating with everyone about what we're going to do. In terms of an impact level, I mentioned that figure of 400 million businesses with an employee or more. There's about another 600 million sole traders, and less than 10 million of those around the world, I would estimate, have taken carbon action today. So we really are interested in providing a vehicle and a theory of change that can help grow that number over the next 5, 10, 20 years in these critical decades of acting on and figuring out how we're going to combat climate change.
It's such a nascent early industry, and it's crazy to think that so much of our business world, the people involved know that they're causing some impact, but it's just so hard to take action. And so the fact that you're making it seriously simple is really important. But I just want to shift gear for a moment, zooming out for a moment. Really curious to know, Carlos, why do you think businesses are uniquely positioned to drive positive environmental change?
So I think if you look at where we are, human history and society and what we value, we're in this, some people call it late stage capitalism. We're in this, technological age where things are getting faster and faster. The rate of change and acceleration is higher than it's ever been. And if you think about, I was asking myself this question, if you think about what do we value in society, who are the heroes? I think the heroes today are like the scientists and the business people. I think that's broadly who society looks to, the people with the knowledge and then the people with the influence and the resources. There's three main parts to society, right? You got government. Government has to do their bit. They have to send the signals and they have to provide the environment for the population to exist in, but they can't do it on their own. And then you've got consumers, and it's very well understood that in the climate space, consumers alone will not solve this problem. Like, consumers are not going to solve the world from climate. So if you look at the offsetting rates, as an example, on like airline tickets, who actually pays the extra money for offsets when you offer consumers the way to do that, you get about less than 2% globally. New Zealand's a bit higher. The peak of Air New Zealand, there was about 7% of people hitting that offset button. It's down to about 3.5% in the current economic climate. So consumer literacy about climate change, we understand. We know there's a problem. We know that flying a plane creates carbon, and we know broadly that planting trees or other offsetting carbon removal techniques sequesters that carbon. So you don't have a knowledge problem. You've got an incentive problem where people don't want to outlay the money to cover it. So then that brings you to businesses, the third part of the puzzle. And I think businesses have an increasingly powerful role in society. They control a lot of these technologies. They also are the source of the majority of carbon emissions. And so we have to figure it out for businesses. In terms of why they're uniquely positioned, I think businesses in the markets we operate in Western liberal democracies in particular, have a fair degree of freedom to operate the way that they, in line with their values, in line with the things they care about. And they also increasingly have I'd say, a duty of care to their communities and to the wider society as their power grows. And I think, the government's power diminishes. So I think that's a long-winded way of saying we value businesses, we see them as heroes, We will be inspired by what those business leaders do, say, think. And for businesses, I actually think competition and survival are the two things that are going to drive action. One, competition, because you want to be first. Consumers increasingly understand climate change. They're increasingly going to vote with their wallets. Businesses are running towards that at varying paces. And then survivalism, I don't even know if that's a word, want the desire to survive. And I think as the impacts of climate change increasingly visible, that is, and the costs are increasingly visible, whether you see that through insurance, whether you see that through decarbonizing to lower carbon technologies, businesses are they want to be around, right? That's their self-interest. So I think those two things are going to drive businesses and positive environmental change. I don't believe it's going to be some intrinsic, we all have a kumbaya moment and all the business leaders realize that that's what they have to do. I think there has been experiments played there, like the Richard Branson's thing, the B team, the B Corporation, that's evolved more into a certification standard, which I think is very useful. But I'm skeptical of the intrinsic thesis. I think it's going to be extrinsic factors, competition and catastrophes that drive businesses to change their behavior and lead on that environmental change.
That's a really interesting perspective. And for what it's worth, I completely agree. But
Yeah, me too.
there's, I guess, as you're talking about this, another factor comes to mind, which is because the key motivators that make change in business are extrinsic incentives, profit or loss, gain or threat, strength and weaknesses, opportunities. That can be seen as a problem, especially for consumers who might be disconnected from the world of business. However, I also see this as a unique opportunity because if you can make the extrinsic motivators, so the incentives for doing good for the environment and good for the climate, a no-brainer for business, the scalability of that is much more than if it's an individual who does what they can do within their time and means, or with a government that has much deeper commitments and ties. The fact that you've got the autonomy of the business, if you can make the business case that helping the climate, helping the environment is the extrinsic motivator, businesses will invest where there's a return. And so I think there's almost this flexibility of engineering the incentives in the private space that you don't get with individuals or with large governments.
Yeah, I like that concept of framing, and the term that I've heard one of the LLM frontier model CEOs use, I think it was the Claude CEO, use was this race to the top. So that is what they are focused on providing and doing, exactly what you described in the generative AI space. How do they find a competitive advantage, lead the way, publicize it, and tell everyone how to do it, which overall makes the whole industry better, and then others are sort of forced into adopting it. And I think there's real power in that, and I think we can apply that thinking in the climate space as well. Yeah, I love that, I think the term "race to the top" rather than the race to the bottom, which we have had in the environmental space and treating the environment as resources for quite a long time, is a useful way to think about it.
Yeah, I think there's definitely change in the thinking of businesses and individuals, worldwide, which hopefully will help drive this this new movement as such. But other than the complexities of measuring your carbon and all of that we've already touched on, what do you think is holding business back at the moment, and how can we lower those barriers?
Yeah, so in terms of what's holding businesses back, how do we reduce those barriers? I think in some ways it's kind of simple for small businesses. They're busy, they're very action oriented, the days are short, the task list is long. And the way we think about this is, when you look at what has catalyzed behavior change, and for small businesses, they do things for three reasons, right? One, it's easy, has to be easy. Two, it's rewarding. Or three, they do it because they're forced to do it by regulation. So one, it's easy. You think about online e-commerce, right? Shopify, pretty nascent adoption through the early dozens. Shopify comes along, eventually gets it to a kind of push button exercise where you can have your small business store online with the push of a button, early 2010s. And by 2024, I think it's 22 or 3% of all commerce is transacted online, of small business commerce. So that's the easy thing. Rewarding, there's got to be a payoff, right? So, I mean, you can use the same metaphor, or you can use something like Wix or having a website, right? You got to get, as a small business, you got to have a website because you need to get traffic and you need to get customers. There's a payoff. And then regulation, or you're forced to do it. Well, you got to do financial statements every year. That's a thing that everyone seems to do, or else the tax authority sends them a penalty. So I think if you think about those, it has to be easy and it has to be rewarding until they are forced to do it. And small businesses are not going to be forced to do it for X amount of time, but let's say 5 years, 7 years, 10 years. I also think in the climate space, there are myths that have become widely perpetuated that many small business owners believe. They believe that it's really hard to measure your carbon footprint. It's going to take lots of time and effort. You've got to invite a consultant into your business. Stop thinking about it, get on with my life. They believe that if they do it, it's going to cost them 20 grand a year and the payoff is unclear. So I think there's these myths. The third one, which is I've been pondering, is this, and Callum, we've been talking a bit about, but is this climate change intellectual complex. And I think it's almost as simple as, when you're at school and there's a small group of people who know something, the cool crew or whatever, and everyone wants to be part of maybe the knowledge is that they're going to a party on the weekend and they've been invited. And you have this feeling as an outsider of, I really want to be part of the cool crew, but I don't know, I'm not party to the conversations. I don't understand what's going on. And I think there's a bit of that in climate change. I think the intelligence and the scientific literacy and the constant kind of intellectualization of this issue has created a couple of camps. The people who know stuff about climate change and the people who don't. And the vast majority of small business owners are in the don't know category. And I think that's really unhelpful because how do you cross that divide? How do you, even educating small business owners on the basics of climate science takes a lot of time. And I'm not necessarily blaming the intellectuals because I think they've done a lot of useful work, the scientists, but I think there's a real divide between those two. And that then underpins the other myths about, it's too hard, it's too complicated, I'll never be in that cool crew. So I'm going to go and, just keep doing my thing, eat my lunch over here, to use the school metaphor. So I think, that's some of the reasons that I've been, that I've reflected on.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. And science communication is a big one that we will have to tackle as a society. So all of that knowledge will be readily, easily available for more people because it takes a lot of mental energy and cross-referencing sometimes to get to the bottom of a few things. And I think carbon and the effects of that falls into that basket.
Yeah, well, take my example. When I was researching before joining CarbonInvoice, after we had agreed to work together, I started reading on all these basic industry terms like carbon neutral, net zero, carbon net positive, then scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, GHG protocols, task force for climate related financial disclosures, emissions trading scheme regulation. It's like, I get it. We need scientific and regulatory robustness to make this work and last. But also, how many people in this room, apart from you, because you used to be a lawyer, can recall one law, one act of government and actually understand every point without referring to it and cross-referencing 10 things? The fact is that we work in this state of lack of knowledge. And I think that complexity is a major problem that is being overcome by CarbonInvoice, and we need more players out there helping to overcome it, communications, all different areas. But What I'm really curious about is the regulatory side. So if we're forced to do something, we do it. I pay my taxes on time, because if I don't, I am going to be penalized. Obviously, that's a pretty good motivator. But how do we ensure, as these regulations come into place, that businesses aren't just doing the bare minimum compliance requirements, and making sure that it's also not leading down towards compliance and greenwashing? How do we make sure that the investments that businesses make into climate and environmental projects drive real, meaningful, lasting change?
Let's tackle that. It's a good question. So I start from, how do you connect humans with the problem and the impact that they can have on that problem? You know, we're mammals, right? So we have this mammalian experiential instinct and memory where we learn stuff through experiencing it. And so I think, you know, the most profound experiences I've had in my life have been when I have been doing something rather than thinking about something, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Concrete examples, just recently was in Dusky Sound in Fiordland on a boat down there for a week, and just, you know, observing and touching and being in that fjord environment and seeing the history and geology kind of playing out. It feels like you can almost see it in real time. It was super affecting for me. So I think, if we can give humans a proper experience with the action and the impact they're taking, then that's a really good start, because that attaches them to it. So one thing we've done, we have run a number of tree planting days in 2024, and planting a tree is another, you know, really can be a really profound experience for humans. We've been blown away with the response to that, getting, you know, business owners, business employees out of the office, out to plant, you know, native trees in a place, again, that is close to and familiar enough to them. You know, it feels like it's their community. But yeah, people have been really affected by it. You can really see that this is a vessel that I have contributed to, that's going to make the world better, and it's going to make my community better. And I think there's a real lesson in that. How do you give people experiences? Increasingly, or particularly in these times where we spend so much time staring at a screen, and I think you can have experiences on screen for sure, but I think the real world calls, and the real world stimulates feelings and things in us that standing in front of a screen doesn't. So that would be one. I think in terms of greenwashing, let's talk about that. So the definition of greenwashing broadly is businesses or people overstating their environmental credentials or actions in a way that is not backed up by evidence, in order to sell more of their products or make their brand look better. Those are the key elements of greenwashing. I think where people get a bit confused is some people think greenwashing is talking about good stuff you've done to combat climate change and using it for marketing. That's not greenwashing. That's marketing the, you know, actual good stuff you've done. I think, you know, we do need stronger regulations and more clarity around greenwashing, because I think, you know, large companies have taken advantage of that. Europe's really leading the way on this. They have the EU directive and are penalising companies. The Australian courts have taken a few corporate cases in the last 6 months with ASIC, the regulator. So I think there's emerging clarity there. We want to be quite careful there, because we want businesses to be proud of and public about the good stuff that they've actually done, while also stopping the bad actors from telling lies. So I think in this case, there is how do you educate people, get them up to speed on the risks of saying the wrong thing. And then thirdly or lastly, I think, how do we drive, you know, investment into projects with lasting impact? I mean, I think the economics is going to do that in a way. So the economics of carbon action becoming a differentiator, the economics of low carbon technologies, you know, getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. You look at examples like solar, and yeah, that's becoming an absolute financial no-brainer. So I think we're approaching the tipping point. We need more and more of those technologies. Stuff like aviation, we're quite a long way behind. We're probably 5 to 10 years off having properly taking a bite out of the aviation carbon footprint based on my rudimentary understanding of the biofuels and stuff. But yeah, I think the economics and the scientific progress is going to drive the economics, assuming we're playing the game of capitalism, which I think is my assumption over the next decade or two.
I definitely resonated a lot with the transparency statement that you just made on your second point. Greenwashing is a term that a few people don't understand, and the only way to overcome that is to be as transparent as possible, that people can see that you're genuine and you're not going to by accident get put into that basket. So if we all would start to genuinely helping, what ripple effects would we see if businesses would start doing that today?
Yeah, it's a nice segue, Anna. I like that. I think the other aspect which makes people feel safe and helps them share information is being part of a community. So that's definitely something we're cultivating at CarbonInvoice, connecting business owners who are taking action in the space or thinking about it to others who already have, and then they can learn and be part of a movement or a group together. And I think that's a powerful tool as well, right? You're not alone. Other people are going through this. Other people are examining the same questions. And then the mana of that community as well. I'm part of this community, and here's what we believe, and here's what we do. So that's partly the previous question, but it's also, I think, relevant to the ripple effects. Small businesses are connected to other small businesses, right? That's whether it's their peers, others in the same industry, whether it's their clients who they work with, whether it's their suppliers. There is this community and network of small businesses. So that's something we've thought about a lot in terms of how we help create that ripple effect. And to go back to that initial data I shared at the start, how we take it from 1 or 5 or 10% of small businesses up to 50%, 60%, 70%.
What about the outcomes? Like if small businesses taking environmental action becomes the norm and that ripples throughout our economy, throughout our society, what kind of outcomes could we expect to see as a result?
More trees, more and more reforestation in Aotearoa in Australia. I think that'd be good. Ultimately more productive and probably happier business owners. I think there's a real risk that small business owners, the heroes of our economy, get tied up in more and more compliance and paperwork and all of that stuff. So I think liberating them from what could be a decent slice of that will make them happier, more productive, spend more time with their families. And I think there's a sort of prosperity thing, right? Economic prosperity, but also just lifestyle prosperity, able to enjoy the places where they live, work, and play, for those places to be greener, healthier. One of the best things about living in here where I live in Wellington is you can go and jump in the ocean with a mask on and go and look at all of New Zealand's fish species out in the marine reserve, or you can go swimming in the harbour with dolphins occasionally. So I think that kind of connection with nature, because we've been able to look after nature, it's important, right?
Yeah. I fully agree. And I think it comes back to the fact that, like you touched on before, we are a mammal. We have evolved in nature. We don't spend a lot of time there anymore because of the way our societies have evolved. But I think when we connect back with it, there's this true moment of happiness. You already touched about CarbonInvoice doing planting action days. What's so special about connecting businesses back to the whenua, back to their backyard?
I didn't think there was that much special about it. So I came from a long family, history of tree planters. My ancestors, as one example, planted some really big redwood, what are now really big redwoods trees in Te Mata Park back in 1927. when they gifted a whole lot of their farm to the people of Hawke's Bay and stuck in 120 Californian redwoods. I grew up with a dad who's an obsessive tree planter. The thing he gets most excited about is like how many trees he's going to plant and which areas he's going to reforest on the farm, native trees. So I really didn't think there was anything that special about it, which was quite a blind spot. So when we said we'll try out some planting days, I thought, oh yeah, sounds good. Some more of those. But yeah, the response from people blew us away. So we had, even in the bitterly cold 5-degree Wellington autumn up on a hill in Belmont Regional Park, we had 45 people turn up, almost like zero drop-off registrations versus attendees. We had, and people are out there having a great time, feeling deeply satisfied. I think the adversity is useful too. Blisters on your hands, numb fingers. It's that it's the hard side of human experience, which then feels really rewarding when you look back at your work and you go, wow, I've put 20 trees in the ground and you're having a beer and a sausage at the end of it. So we've seen, and as another, I think, data point, we've invited customers to come back to those same plantations and do what we call tree rescue action days. And we've locked in a few of those over summer. So obviously planting the tree is the hero moment, but they need care, nurturing, ongoing work. And I think that was a real cool signal for me that people want to come back and do those tree rescue days. We've had people bring their kids, and I think, showing a 6-year-old how you plant a tree, and that you can plant a tree. And I think people love the storytelling aspect as well, of showing that they are out there taking real action in their community, with the environment. We're going to go much bigger in 2025 and 10 times the number we're running. And then, we should have a lot more learnings on how that kind of connection with nature can be a really positive and profound thing for us mammal humans.
Yeah, I think, not to sound too proverbial here, but when you bring someone to a planting day, you're also planting a seed inside them. If this is the first time they've planted a native tree and this is the first connection, or it's a connection that's reconnecting something in their mind, that is planting a seed that grows. They might not take major action directly as a result of that planting day, but it gets you thinking. And alongside that, it's got trees in the ground that wouldn't have been there otherwise. So I think that's really cool. I think it's important that we connect our actions back to things that are getting us into the wild. Is this our first podcast with someone from business?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, so all of our prior podcasts have been with people in the conservation space that are typically doing things with nature, and that's what they show up all day doing. And it's really interesting to see the mirror between what's needed in business and what's needed in the conservation space, because the feedback that we're repeatedly getting is that connecting people to the whenua, connecting people to understanding whether it's the results of predator control, whether it's the results of planting trees or removing the possums from your farm so your lemon trees grow better, is that the feedback we've received from people in the conservation space is when you get people connected back to the land, magic happens. So it's really interesting to hear that mirrored from your perspective in business.
Totally. Yeah. And I think those experiences are going to go up in terms of popularity and the satisfaction people get from them, because we're on this exponential curve with AI and data and software. And I think that means more time behind the computer, more maybe eventually the computer in our brain, more and more stimulation of this kind. And I think, the craving for in-person experiences that connect us to nature is that's going to go up. So we can harness that as conservation groups and as business owners trying to make a difference and really help people rebuild that connection with nature.
Yeah. And I can't help but imagine fast forwarding 5 years or 10 years and having 1 million businesses a year, or people in business a year, planting trees all over the world. Or imagine if this scaled up to its logical limit, and that the highlight of people's workday was planting a native tree, and that became a normal part of the culture where if you're not doing this as your business, that's weird. That would be my dream come true. But how about you, Carlos? If you could wave a magic wand and CarbonInvoice could have any outcome, no matter how big or ambitious, what would that look like?
Yeah, I love that. I love that concept. It makes me think of the Rewilding book by George Monbiot, which I presume you guys maybe have you read that?
I haven't read it, but it does ring a bell.
It's basically about how we bring our natural environment. We've separated them off into national parks here, cities here. People live mainly in cities, then occasionally go to visit the national parks. How do you reintegrate those two things so that humans and environment are integrated and are, one and the same thing? He calls it rewilding, but it's a beautiful story which aligns to your vision. So I think waving the magic wand, I mean, 1 billion business owners every day can do something contributory and useful towards climate change. That might be planting a tree, that might be devoting a portion of their profit to other carbon removal projects, that might be going and sharing their story with a young entrepreneur about how to build a business that that might be having even a conversation with a really invigorated new younger employee who's going to inherit the planet and is deeply inspired. I think that's my dream. Every business owner every day doing something useful and meaningful on climate change in a way that doesn't stress them out, make them feel bad, confuse them, in a way that is positive and makes them feel good and like they are contributing to this human-wide challenge.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Bringing that to concrete action, then, what are your practical tips that you would give to a business on how they can help the climate, how they can help environment and nature on a practical daily basis?
You gotta start, right? If you're not doing anything, you gotta start somewhere. You need to begin. So figure out what your beginning is and don't listen to the people who tell you it's too hard and you're too busy. It's not that hard and you can start today. And starting might be we're going to measure our carbon footprint. Starting might be we're going to cut 30% of our flights next year because we've now tested the working remotely stuff and it's working so well. Starting somewhere might be we're going to invest in an EV, right? There's different ways to start, but just start and, get some ticks in the to-do list. Don't get stuck in the paralysis by analysis trap, the we'll do it in 2026 trap. Yeah, I mean, listen to your kids if you've got them, or go and talk to your kids about it. The other great thing about planting days was I really struggled to explain to my 3-year-old what I did for a job. But then I just told him, I just plant trees. And he's like, yeah, my daddy plants trees. That's now his understanding of me. So if you can, my point is, if you can talk to your kids in terms that they understand, then it all gets simple. Sometimes we tend to overcomplicate things as adults. So yeah, there's a few starting points.
And that is so true with the overcomplicating. I feel like when you're a kid, you see the world through a different lens, and sometimes we have to remind ourselves that it starts with that small action. Don't overthink that, be that reducing your flights or planting that tree. And speaking of tree planting, which I personally think is a really rewarding experience as well. What does a healthy ecosystem look like to you, Carlos?
I think a healthy ecosystem is one where life is maintaining and ideally increasing. An unhealthy ecosystem is one where life is declining and reducing. And we have some big challenges there, right? Like the extinction of species is moving faster than it ever has. We're losing huge amounts of life at a global level. So I think you kind of got to start there, really.
What about conservation? What does conservation mean to you?
I think conservation is about looking after the environment that you live, work, and play in. Ultimately, there's a conserving the amount of resources and stuff that you take out of it. There's that side of the definition, or that definition of the word. But I think there's also the preservation side. How do you preserve all the parts of the place that you operate in? So yeah, for me, it's about, being cautious and careful with certainly resource extraction. Like if you're picking things or taking things out of an environment, I was talking with my brother about this with seaweed, for instance. You can take as much seaweed out of the beach as you like in Aotearoa at the moment from a regulatory side, but the general heuristic is you don't take more than 20%. And, that's an example of you're putting the interests of the existing population of, animals or vegetables or whatever first, so that they will survive for the next generation.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, right? The next generation, ensuring that it's still a healthy ecosystem for them, because life is not just going to stop, it will carry on. And the healthier, the better for everything that lives on this planet.
Yeah, there's an implicit kind of acknowledgement that I am not going to be here in hopefully 60 or 80 years from now, and that there will be other life forms that will come after me. So there's that kind of ethical aspect of how do you conserve what we have for their benefit, for the sustenance, maintenance of life.
And that's why I also think that tree planting is such a fulfilling, strong action, because yes, you feel good when you're planting the tree, right? But essentially, you're not planting the tree for yourself. It'll be your kids or your grandkids that actually reap the benefits of your action. And to me, that's probably, why it causes so much happiness and why it can be a life-changing experience. So if people want to learn more about CarbonInvoice, how can they get in touch?
So I'm love to talk, Carlos at CarbonInvoice.com. So it's my email. If you want to come to a planting day, then register, check out the planting days will be on our website, CarbonInvoice.com. Yeah, we'd love to have you there. So you can either come along as an attendee, or you can join us to co-host and sponsor one of the events and bring a whole lot of your community along. As you say, Anna, come and plant a tree, not for yourself, but for the next generation who comes after you, for your children, for their children, and for the life forms that will come in the future.
Awesome. Yeah, hopefully we'll see you at a planting day. I'm really excited to see how this book develops and what the story at the end of the day is.
I'm excited to come plant trees.
Can't wait. Yeah, we've got a spade with your name on it, Anna.
It's been such a pleasure having you on the call today, Carlos. Thank you for joining us, and all the best with the future for CarbonInvoice.
Yeah, thank you for sharing an easy solution for businesses to get involved in the simplest way possible.
Yeah, cheers both.
Kia ora.